So when we think about the history of understanding mental illness and the treatment of mental illness, it goes in waves and cycles. But what I will tell you is that there are three general approaches that people wind up using. There is the supernatural model, there is the medical model, and then there's what we come to later in history called the biopsychosocial model, or what I call the biopsychosocial spiritual model. But the early views of mental illness operated based on the supernatural. So if I were to ask you, well, what causes mental illness? In early history, one might say mental illness is caused by evil spirits. So evil spirits are going to alter your mental state. So being possessed by an evil spirit, there were several ways historically that people tried to get that evil spirit out. One way was called trephination. So if the cause of mental illness was an evil spirit and we could get this evil spirit out, we would be able to cure you. So what was trephination? Trephination was a process where they took these tools and drilled a hole through your skull. And the belief was that when you drilled this hole, it allowed the evil spirit to leave because it's somehow trapped. So when you make this hole, the spirit can leave. Now, the reality is that drilling a hole in a person's skull was somewhat effective in treating mental illness. And I say that very jokingly. It was effective at treating mental illness insofar as a lot of people died from it. And you can't have a mental illness if you're dead. So one of the biggest problems with these drills is they oftentimes cause brain damage and death. So trephination was one way to get the spirit out. And then there was another approach called exorcism. And exorcism was a process of trying to coax the evil spirit out. So exorcism occurs in many traditions, and it even occurs pre-Christianity. Now, when we think of exorcism, there's the movie The Exorcist, where it happened to be a priest. But it wasn't always just a priest. It was some spiritual leader, clergy, who, whether it be a priest, a shaman, etc., they would try and convince this spirit to leave the body. Now, how successful were they? Typically not very successful. So we know that the supernatural model of mental illness, while it comes back and forth in society, is not all that accurate. But it was there, and we even see some of the treatments from it. So moving further, as I said, there was also this medical model, right, or biological model, which believed that mental illness was caused by some kind of physical problem. And the earliest work on trying to assess physical problems was with bodily fluids. So you might hear the term humors. And the humors were various bodily fluids that people believed were somehow connected to mental health. So if and the fluids they looked at were uh, blood, mucus, and fecal matter, right? So if a person uh, had yellow bile, they were perceived to be in a manic state, right? They were perceived to be more quick tempered, right? So that appearance of fecal matter, they interpreted to be manic. If you had black bile, very dark fecal matter, they interpreted that to be a depressive state. Blood was viewed to be a vital, uh, linked with vitality and health. So, healthy blood flow was considered to be linked to happiness. Now, what's interesting is that you do see a whole lot of work with blood historically, things like bloodletting, right? Things like using leeches to draw out the blood. What that was designed to replace the old quote unquote bad blood with healthier blood, and that was linked to being happy. Now, being overly phlegmy or mucusy, they viewed that that was linked to being more apathetic, aloof, distant, and so forth. So it's interesting. We're looking at some kind of body flow or fluid as an indicator of mental health. Now, can we use blood as an indicator of mental health? Can we use stool samples as part of an assessment of mental health? Sure, we can, to some degree. But I would recommend you avoid over interpreting. It is not the way we view the humors, right? So, with a simple blood test, we can detect a whole lot of conditions, right? But that isn't the only predictor. One of the things you're going to hear me say is that um, mental health problems are multifaceted. There are many origins of mental health problems. So if you have depression, is it going to show up necessarily in your blood? Probably not. If you're engaging in some form of substance abuse, is that going to show up in your blood? Sure, right? So there are some conditions we can detect, others we can't. And depression comes from many places: genetics, it comes from the environment, it comes from stress, and so forth. But I introduce you to this because even the humors that we're talking about, um, this approach was incomplete and insufficient, right? So the treatments, warm baths. Do warm baths help people? Yes, they help with anxiety and stress. But what you're going to find out is that they in of themselves are usually not a complete treatment. You might feel good in a warm bath temporarily, but once you leave the bath, you might return to whatever mood state you started with. Same thing with massage. Massage, if you get a really good massage, you might be walking on air, feeling very light and, you know, lifted. But in a couple days, the effects of the massage wear off. And obviously, bloodletting, same thing. It doesn't really work. So this model of mental illness also is incorrect. The reason why I bring it up, though, is because there are some physical factors linked to mental illness, and I don't want us to throw everything away here. Now, during the Middle Ages in Europe, we started to see uh, a regression back to strong supernatural belief sets. So, the power of religion becomes very strong, in the belief that you might be possessed by the devil or things of that nature. uh, these factors result in earlier methods that didn't work, like exorcism and some of the more primitive strategies we talked about earlier. Now, ultimately, this supernatural approach loses favor again. So you're starting to see how we understand mental illness. It goes in waves, it goes up and down, it shifts. But once again, you're going to see it falls out of favor. And we start to see during the Renaissance period another push towards this medical model that mental health problems have physical impairment. And where do we see this? We start to see people saying there's a parallel between physical sickness and psychological illness. For example, Johann Weyer, he suggested that the mind is susceptible to sickness the same way the body is. And we believe Weyer to be one of the founders of modern psychopathology. And as we moved away from the demonology or demonological views, people started to get better, which is really interesting. So those primitive methods did not cure mental illness. So trying to understand the physical effects and causes was shifted people into positive. So you start to also see community health programs develop, and you start to see there being an emphasis on treating mental illness and the community playing a role in that. Now, what is interesting is I mentioned the word asylum. Now, today, we don't have a positive view on the concept of an asylum. We don't view it very positively. And the reasoning is because it became a place where we just warehouse the mentally ill. But asylums were initially built as kind of a retreat, and we'll talk about the retreat model, where people can, go to an asylum, get whatever help they needed, recharge their batteries, so to speak, and then they would be able to reemerge in society. But that's not what asylums turned into. Asylums eventually would basically be a place where if you were deemed to be mentally ill, they would put you in an asylum and they would lock you there and throw away the key. And you would never see the day of light again, right? So asylums became pretty bad. So if we look at some asylums, as an example, the Bethlehem Hospital, which I realized my previous slides had a typo. This is in London, turned into a tourist attraction where they basically chained patients to the wall and you could hear them crying and moaning all day. And for a token amount of money, you could visit an asylum and see how people who are mentally ill lived. La Bicitre in France, similar conditions where people were shackled to the wall. And this particular hospital looked more like a dungeon than anything else, where they were in damp, cold conditions, oftentimes with rats and all kinds of poorly lit conditions. And they were there suffering. And what were they fed? They weren't fed steak or regular food that you or I would want to eat. They were served food that was spoiled, rotten, no longer edible. And this is how people were treated in the asylums. This is how the mentally ill were viewed. What is interesting is that the asylums were places where you could put someone and not have to see the effects of mental illness. So you could put a person in an asylum and imagine that mental illness didn't occur. But these asylums were basically torture chambers, if you ask me. Now, this is the way life was for quite some time. And what we see is in the 1800s, there is a shift in movement trying to either reform asylums or get rid of them. And one of the early places is in France. Philippe Pinel is responsible for pushing against this inhumane treatment, pushing against the idea that you're supposed to just lock people up, chain them against the wall, and so forth. And what he advocated for was bringing people back up into healthy living conditions, bringing people into real rooms with lighting and warmth, and being able to roam the grounds rather than be chained to the wall. And Philippe Pinel did this in La Bicitre as well as in a all-female institution. Now, what you're seeing on the right is actually a picture of Philippe Pinel and his influence in releasing the mentally ill. Now, Philippe Pinel was not alone in these efforts. These efforts were happening in other parts of the world. So William Tuke developed what we now call modern retreat, and he designed the grounds to be very, very vast and green, and people could sit and soak in the sun. They could ride horses. They could socialize with one another. And the effects of what Pinel did and Tuke did and so forth were powerful. What we see was that people started to really get better. So the idea of treating people with dignity and respect as they navigate mental illness became very important. And we know one of the essential features of people getting better is the kind of relationship you have with them as a clinician. Treating your clients with respect and dignity, trying to empathize with them is going to go much further than harsh judgment and punitive measures. So we see this happening, as I said, in Europe, and then we start to see a movement in the United States called the moral treatment approach. So in addition to what was happening by Pinel and Tuke, this same model came to the United States. So it's not a different model. Pinel and Tuke used this model, but it was the idea that you treat people with dignity and respect, and they will eventually get better. And that's what really happened. That's what happened back then. And the assumption of the moral treatment model is that you could either overcome whatever your struggles are, or at least function with your struggles. You did not need to be cast away. So we see this happening in the United States. We have major influencers here as well. So Benjamin Rush. Now, some of you may have seen the name Benjamin Rush, not in a psychology course, but in a history course. What do I mean by that? Benjamin Rush is known to have been one of the signatories on the US Constitution, or Declaration of Independence, forgive me. So Benjamin Rush was, a very influential figure, but he also operated based on this moral model or moral treatment model, where he understood the importance of dignity and respect of his patients. And even the people that worked for him, he had a process of screening them. He required all people who work with him to be compassionate, intelligent, and also kind of engage in some kind of positive reinforcement by giving token gifts to their patient from time to time. So it increases morale. So he really focused on how to make the patients feel better. Now, Dorothea Dix, you also might have seen this name not just in psychology but in nursing. This is a very popular name, but one of the things that Dorothea Dix was responsible for was advocating to Congress to overhaul these asylums. If the asylums were merely warehousing the mentally ill, then she wanted Congress to do something about it. And what Congress did was they created state regulated hospitals. Now, that sounds really good, right? So now instead of leaving these asylums to be run on their own without oversight, now the government's going to step in and help make sure that people are getting what they deserve. So early state-run hospitals were really well managed, really well run. But unfortunately, state-run hospitals, as you will see, just become asylums by another name. They regress back to the same poor treatment. But let me explain. So I said that the hospitals regress back to just asylums by another name. What are some of the factors that caused there to be a regression in these state-run hospitals, even with the oversight? Well, the answers are here. One of the things was that these mental hospitals, these state-run hospitals, did a very good job initially at working with people who had mental illness. So if the model is working, let's expand. That was the mindset. So you start to see more and more state-run hospitals created. The problem is the funding for these state-run hospitals did not keep up with the rate of growth of the hospitals. And that being said, we see that there are financial limitations, and all of a sudden, hospitals are asked to do more with less money. So when you're asked to do more with less money, you're not going to be able to provide the same level of care. So that was one issue. A second issue is that people were put into these state-run hospitals regardless of their diagnosis. And there was this assumption that anyone who had a mental illness could be treated, when in reality, there are some conditions that require a lot of work. So if you just throw everyone into a state-run facility who has a mental illness, not everyone's going to get better. So, and you're going to have more and more people that are not getting better as you continue to throw people into these state-run hospitals. We also see that people who had mental illnesses were stigmatized. So any bizarre, strange behavior, people were put in a hospital, even if it wasn't a mental illness, right? So it's pretty wild. We start to see state hospitals used to kind of sanitize society. And last but not least, we see waves of immigration coming in. And there started to be these tests, right? These tests on language as well as moral fitness tests. And if a person was deemed to be unfit, either they were sent back, they were not allowed, they didn't gain entry into the United States, or some people who were immigrants because of um, the differences in culture, were institutionalized. And that's it's a misuse of the state hospitals. So if we look, there are a lot of factors that caused these long-term hospitalizations. Um, and all of a sudden, as I said, state-run hospitals became asylums by another name. And I want you to appreciate that, because we talk about Willowbrook, right? So the College of Staten Island is on the former grounds of Willowbrook State School, which was a state-run facility. And in that state-run facility, we see some horrors occurred. Individuals with intellectual disabilities or autism or other cognitive impairments were left at Willowbrook, and Willowbrook's funding was also pretty tight. And rumor got out that during Willowbrook, people were left to roll around in their own fecal matter, unclothed, poorly tended to, fed in 2-minute increments with blended food. And this is how people lived. And parents were sending their children to Willowbrook thinking that their children are going to get treated with dignity and respect. Ultimately, Geraldo Rivera, in his early days, did an expose on Willowbrook. And he brought a camera crew. And he revealed the atrocities of Willowbrook. And he went once. Now, the Willowbrook staff said, "Oh, you came on a bad day. Come back again for a scheduled tour. We want to show you all of Willowbrook." Of course, the second time, when Geraldo Rivera came with his crew, the conditions looked very different. All of a sudden, people were clothed. There was ample staff. The food looked different. People were, allowed to eat for a half hour, which is normal. Now, Geraldo Rivera knew that this was just a sham. So he came back a third time, unannounced, uninvited, and it was back to the original. And then he revealed these were the living conditions in Willowbrook State School. Once again, a state-run facility where the assumption was you're going to live there for the rest of your life, and the inhumane treatment. And that kind of became the beginning of the end of state hospitals. Now, we still have state hospitals, but there will eventually be a shift towards community-based treatment. And I will talk to you about that shortly. But I do want to repackage the models. I said there are 3 basic models for understanding mental illness, right? There was the supernatural model, which we talked about, demons, spirits, things like that. We talked about the medical model, which when we talk about the medical model, we're also referring to it as the somatogenic. So the medical model and the somatogenic perspective are one in the same. If we were to use the same strategy that we used on the initial slide of what is psychopathology, and we were to draw a line in the word somatogenic, we would draw a line after somato before genic. Now, anyone know what the word soma or somatic means? What does the word soma mean in biology? It means body. So if you have a somatogenic perspective of mental illness, bodily causes are the root of mental illness, or physical causes. Now, genic, right, the root is gene or genesis. Genesis is creation. So the body causes mental illness. That's the medical or somatogenic model. So that's model number 2. The psychogenic model, that was revolutionary. This is our third and final model, which is the body or the mind has mental illness due to some kind of psychological cause. Again, psycho being the mind, genic being cause or creation. So the mind causes mental illness. Big difference, right? Big shift. So what are the evidences for this? Well, we talked about Hippocrates earlier, but this reemergence came from Emil Kraepelin, which is kind of the person who framed some of the earliest psychological disorders. And he identified some interesting patterns, such as excessive fatigue could result in mental dysfunction. He also identified the fact that syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted illness, could cause psychological impairment. For example, early untreated syphilis resulted in psychotic states. So the idea that some kind of disease could cause a mental illness, this was his evidence, right? So the idea of a somatogenic model, it makes sense, right? So if you put it all together, hey, there are some physical causes here to mental illness, great. But there is another way of looking at it, right? The psychogenic model. Now, I didn't cover this when I talked about Rome, but we do see people like Cicero suggested that mental illness had psychological causes, but it became popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s because of people like Freud. And Freud was able to demonstrate that things like hysteria, people reporting some kind of paralysis without something physically wrong with them, he said there must be something in the mind causing that. And Freud becomes a powerhouse in pushing understanding the mind can cause mental illness. Today, I said we put it all together as a biopsychosocial model, right? Biopsychosocial. There are biological factors like the somatogenic approach. There are psychological factors like the psychogenic approach, but we also recognize your environment plays a role as well. So now, what's interesting is that a lot of this also demonstrated that some mental health treatment could occur outpatient. So Freud, there's a famous pictures of his couch and him doing therapy on his couch in his home office. That wasn't in a hospital. So there was dialogue, hey, maybe not every condition needs hospitalization. So I would say to some degree, we've come a long way. When you think about it, we're no longer drilling holes in people's head. We're not engaging in trephination. We're not engaging in exorcism. But even though we've come a long way, we still have a significant stigma as it relates to mental illness. For example, you will hear, this was a survey done, 43% of people believe that those people with mental illness bring it upon themselves. So saying you choose to be mentally ill, that's going to induce stigma, isn't it? 35% of people believe that mental illness is caused by sin. And 19% of people believe that it's due to lack of willpower. So all three of these suggest some level of blaming the victim, right? Blaming the person with a mental illness for their own struggles. And while we're not drilling holes in people's head, we are still not as kind as we should be to people with mental illness. Now, so there have been uh, major shifts, right? You can see the historical change, but I want you to see that as we start to believe that treatment can occur in a community, the rates of hospitalization go down. Now, one factor that caused the closing of state hospitals or institutions was the exposure of the horrors and atrocities that occurred in the state hospitals. But that wasn't just it. Another factor became absolutely critical. We started to learn to harness medication in a meaningful way. So there was this boom in the 1950s of psychotropic medication. And not that there weren't other medications on the market earlier, but that became the age of truly trying to identify medications that could help with mental states. So we see in the 1950s things like a massive boom in antipsychotics. So if you can give a medication that eliminates or reduces hallucinations and delusions, well, people with schizophrenia don't have to be hospitalized as much. Antidepressants. If you can find medication that will lift people's mood so that they're not suicidal, well, maybe they don't need to be hospitalized as much. Anxiolytics. If you can find medications that help reduce anxiety so people can socialize and function better in society and be able to do their work, then maybe you don't need to be hospitalized. So you see, there are several factors that resulted in this dehospitalization, right? So we have the revelation of how bad people were treated in these hospitals, but we also have the help of medication. And I will tell you that there are many conditions where medication is quite helpful, and it allows people to function well in society. So I do not want you to stigmatize taking medication either. Now, I will argue shortly that not every medication should, pardon me, not every mental health condition should medication be your first line treatment, right? Therapy should be your first line treatment for most conditions. But there are some where medication is essential right from the beginning. So if a person is hallucinating, I think it's good to get medication in the system so you can actually have a conversation. So there is less paranoia, there is less delusional thought content, but not every condition is like that. I see something in the chat. So side effects might occur when getting addicted to these psychotropic antidepressant medications. So that is also a myth. Not all medications are habit forming. So you'll see that the DEA has a classification of drugs, Schedule 1 through 5. And if a drug is a Schedule 1 or 2 drug, then we do have a concern. We do worry about it. For example, OxyContin, that never should have been released to the market. We knew how addictive it was. But there are medications that are not habit forming or not as habit forming. And what do I mean by that? If it's not habit forming, then you're not going to become addicted to it, right? Not every medication is like that. So Xanax, I would say you have to be careful. But things like Lexapro, not as much. So even drugs, we have to be mindful that not every drug has the same level of habit forming tendencies. So yeah, but medication, if it's a choice between medication and being able to function in society or no medication and being hospitalized, most people would choose to take the medication so that they can function in society, even some that you might need to take regularly. So let's see. All right. So that is kind of the movement. Now, if you look at this graph, there is a sharp drop in hospitalizations. Today, we don't take the mindset that when a person is hospitalized, they're going to be hospitalized for the rest of their life. In fact, the model today is to help a person move to baseline and discharge them as soon as possible. So the idea that we talked about earlier of being locked away and the key thrown away, like in Beauty and the Beast, that's not the current way we relate to inpatient hospitalization. In fact, the vast majority of treatment happens in the community. Now, one of the problems with a movement of deinstitutionalization is sometimes you wind up closing a state hospital where people actually needed to be there. So, what happens when you overcorrect and you close hospitals that needed to be there? Well, we find a significant portion of people wind up living in boarding houses or subsisting in boarding houses where they just have a room. Or we find a significant portion of people are homeless, right? There's a significant portion of people are homeless who have mental illness that they cannot cope or function properly. And then the largest provider of mental health services, do you know what it is? The prison system. So we find a lot of people with mental illness wind up in prison. So this movement of deinstitutionalization, while it's good in one respect that people who don't need to be institutionalized can function well in society, it's bad when people who are not functioning in society wind up either on the streets or in prison. That was the downside. So, as I said, we now have a model of outpatient care. Typically, the vast majority of treatment will happen with a therapist in the community. You might see your clinician once a week, and that's great. Does that mean that hospitalization does not happen today? Of course not. There are times where hospitalization is still necessary, but it's typically a short-term hospitalization. It's not a lifelong hospitalization. The average stay in an inpatient hospital is less than 2 weeks, to give you perspective. So if a person needs to be hospitalized, there's already, from the time they're in, a movement to help get them out. And my earliest experience with mental health treatment was at South Beach Psychiatric Center. That's where I did my externship. And I can tell you, I've been in these meetings, and the goal is, how do we stabilize the patient and how do we work towards discharge? These are the two questions that are asked in every meeting. Now, it is, the goal is to move them back to baseline, how they functioned before they decompensated. One of my personal criticisms is perhaps we're rushing people out too early. And I've seen re-hospitalizations occur because of that, where a person got out and then they wound up back, and then they get out, wind up back, over and over and over. Now, if you do have an inpatient hospitalization, we typically, when we do discharge, we arrange treatment in the community for aftercare. So we are going to give you typically 14 days medication. We're going to schedule an appointment with a doctor for medication management. We're going to find you a clinician to do therapy. We're going to make sure you have housing needs met, and so forth. That's what we mean by follow-up aftercare. But after that, then the community takes over. And We also have community mental health centers. After I worked at South Beach, I had the privilege of doing my internship at Hamilton Madison House, which is a bicultural center in Lower Manhattan. And usually it treats the Asian American community, the Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, and so forth. The problem with this was that there were only two major Asian focused treatment centers. So there was Charles B. Wang and Hamilton Madison House. So while we talk about community mental health and building an infrastructure in a community, we do see there aren't enough mental health providers and community centers out there. And roughly 40% of people struggling actually get treatment. So there's a large portion of people struggling with mental illness because the resources aren't there. Now I'm going to stop there and I'm going to take attendance one more time. But any thoughts or reactions to this? Thoughts, comments, reactions?
Do people like sorry, but do people rush the patients to go out because of financial reasons, or because I don't know, the so many people are coming in always at the time?
Good question. I would say both, and then other reasons as well. Um, there aren't enough beds, right? So a unit might have 20 beds, let's say. And so when someone's admitted, that means that there's someone else waiting for that bed. They might be in the actual local hospital for your observation until they can get that bed if they need it. So one thing is, yes, we don't have enough beds. The other thing is that financially, we want to make sure that we can provide the care we need to. So if we take too many people, it'll go back to the historical narrative I talked to you about of underfunding and trying to expect the same care. And then there are other reasons as well, of course. So, all right. So that's a good question. Let's stop there, and we'll pick up next
Professor,
section. Yes.
do you think that